Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, I'll be speaking with Victoria Barnett-Woods, who is an assistant teaching professor at Loyola University Maryland in the Humanities Department, where she specializes in literature of the long 18th century. And in this episode, we will be discussing the article that she wrote, Bequeathed Unto My Daughter, Slaves, Women, Slavery, and Property in the 18th Century, Atlantic. So let's have a listen. I just wanted to thank you so much, Victoria, for coming on to the podcast today and to discuss your article, as it is very personal to me because this is what I discovered in my own family history research. To know that this took place in history, it took place back, and that to have the conversation, I guess, of to know that your father has bequeathed slaves, enslaved people to you as for your advancement in life and to make sure that you were well taken care of. So,
yes,
that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I was just excited, and when I came across your article, because this matched with what I came across in my research in genealogy. So I just want to, start off with, this is a group of people, women, that aren't normally talked about in history, and in particular, free persons of colors that owned slaves.
yes.
Why was this something important for you to write about?
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you for the invitation for me to discuss the article in further detail. So for me, actually, I was in graduate school. I got my PhD in English literature. And interestingly enough, I came across this historical phenomenon, there's historical precedents of women of color who were either formerly enslaved or were they were grandchildren or granddaughters of enslaved women who were bequeathed in other enslaved people as property.
Yes.
I came across this actually through a novel. It's an all-star, I know, right? There is an 1808 novel titled The Woman of Color. There is a 2008 modern edition of it through Broadview Press. If anybody is interested, it's great. But for those who are unfamiliar with this, I think hopefully increasingly more well-known novel, especially I think within the 18th century studies context. For those unfamiliar with the novel, though, The Woman of Color, it tells the story of a woman by the name of Olivia Fairfield, who is herself a woman of mixed heritage, who is obligated under the conditions of her father's will to marry a cousin by the name of Augustus in England. So from Jamaica, she travels to England and she absolutely hates it there. We as the reader are encountering kind of her interior reflection of her experiences in Bristol and in London, and then finally in this kind of more rural setting in Devon, England. But while she is in Bristol, she encounters racism, and we, as the reader, are witness to that. She is privy to corruption in London, and it's not until she moves out of these urban spots and into more rural agricultural settings that she finds kind of a husband, right? A husband and a place and safety and security there. These conditions are, in terms of her father's will, these conditions of her existence, of her needing to keep her wealth, because that was the stipulation, is that if she didn't marry her cousin, she would lose all of her money, right? And she was incredibly wealthy, or at least her father was. And so these conditions are certainly uncomfortable at their best and full of patriarchal hostility at their worst for the modern, at least for the modern day reader. And in the introduction, and there's a plot twist at the end of this novel that I will not unveil unless readers are curious. It has to do with her marriage to Augustus, but I'll leave that for readers to get very excited about potentially. But it was in the introduction that prefaced the 1808 novel, the modern edition, that the editor, Lyndon Dominique, he speculates that the writer of that novel, because it was published anonymously, may have been Anne Wright Maitland, one of the figures that I discuss in the article. And the issue is that she is Anne Wright Maitland, born Anne Wright, is a historical woman whose records we can trace, who had not exactly the same, but incredibly similar conditions placed upon her from her own father, that she had to marry somebody of white ancestry in order for her to keep her wealth. And so when I was reading this novel, I initially wanted to think of kind of our intervention of women and property, and the work that I've done, kind of thinking about the Caribbean and the larger transatlantic connections. I initially thought of this project as something situated within a feminist lens, but when unpacking the history of the 18th century Atlantic world and thinking about this novel, and then thinking about the historical figures that connect to this fictional figure, I had to rethink, right, this novelistic representation and the potential historical reference of an intersectional identity, someone who had to deal with issues of not just race, but also gender. And so what I found, kind of thinking through, starting with this novel, was connecting this fictional figure of Olivia Fairfield with the historical Anne Wright Maitland. Then all of a sudden emerged this kind of larger scholarly sensitivity to the fact that there were historical women of color who inherited property from their white fathers. And a lot of that property included enslaved men and women.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And because, as I said before, this is what I've uncovered in my own family line researching in Jamaica. And what would you say that these free women of color, the impact they had on their independence and choice that came for having enslaved persons through inheritance?
Yeah, it is an element, as far as I'm concerned. It's an element that is quite understudied when thinking about the British West Indies. And after I kind of share my response, I'd love to hear what you have uncovered in terms of individuals who have inherited, folks of color who have inherited. And so I want to hear kind of what you have uncovered, because I think it's incredible. Because I approach it as my interest is that of a historian, of a scholar. You yourself are a historian. I unfortunately don't have any personal connections to the history itself, but I think, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that it's absolutely important. And I think more investigation and research should be done. I think also, as a scholar, maybe part of the reasons why this is an understudied component, the fact that we have free women of color who are independence and choice, and have money and resources through the system of enslavement, is that it is difficult, I think, for anybody to reckon with and massage into, I guess, the complexities of this history, and kind of juxtapose it, and to juxtapose it or include it to this history, this narrative of the past that we have. At least in the United States, there is this dichotomy of white enslaver, Black enslaved. And while this is certainly a overall historical important truth that even individuals in this country wish to deny, I think that there's this additional compounding truth that is included to this dichotomy that that indicates that there is truth behind the fact that folks of African ancestry were enslavers. Like there are individuals who relied on and were dependent upon the system of institutionalized slavery to survive. And so the language of representing these women is a little sticky because on one hand, historians, I myself want to applaud these women for making a name for themselves, for their courage, for the tenacity, especially when thinking about Judith Philippe, for example, like thinking about their sheer strategic genius and will to power. And so that's something that I want to applaud. That's something that I'm like, yes, these women have agency. That is great. Congratulations, ladies. But then on the other hand, we have to reconcile with something that seems like a hypocrisy that these women inherited, participated in, and perpetuated the institution of slavery while they were living and working as enslavers in the Caribbean.
No, definitely. And I know that you said, that I do have that, personal connection, and
Yes.
it brings a different layer to it because now you see things a little bit differently. Because yes, they had their freedom. Yes, they had the wealth, transferred down, but at the same time that they owned individuals, they're as well helping others that were escaping slavery, which
Mm-hmm.
when I came across was like, well, but you owned. So
Yeah.
they themselves were kind of in a mixed bag type of position because they knew that they had, their section in life was much higher, their standard was higher, but at the same time, still trying to assist others that were trying to get their freedom as well. So I don't think it was necessarily for them to have it was cut and dry, but it was
Mm-hmm.
a lot of gray in there. And yes, it definitely did bring about to see things differently and why things are they are today and how that line was able to be so prominent within their own community. And some of them didn't necessarily marry. Were single their entire lives, but they had so
Mm-hmm.
much power within the community that they didn't have to. People knew who they were based on their status and their name, so to speak. So it's very, how would I say, as it's not black and white, it's
Yeah.
very gray. There's a lot of gray and it's a mixed bag, right? Because it's not necessarily that you're totally upset with them and you're not totally happy with them at the same time for what you've
Yeah.
uncovered because the story isn't as straight as it should be.
Yeah. I do you happen to have your previous comment about individuals who were both enslavers but then assisted others to their freedom? Do you happen to have a story of an ancestor who did that?
Yes. But I don't have the actual title because I saw it in a book. So I'd have to go
Ah.
back and read it. But yes, she and it was a female. She did assist
Mm-hmm.
others because she was in St. Catherine's. So and at that time it was St. Thomas Ye Vale. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, in that area where they lived, she definitely assisted others in being able to obtain their freedom and they called it the underground, railroad, so to speak, in Jamaica. So it was just very interesting to come across that particular reading and to see that, yes, she owned slaves herself and yet was assisting others to obtain their freedom, which I'm just, I'm just
Yeah.
kind of dumbfounded in a way to know that that actually happened.
Yeah, I think that's so funny that they called it an underground railroad
Yeah.
because that would have predated, in fact, a lot of the work that was being done in the United States. But that's awesome. That is
hmm
great.
No, but it's just
Um,
one of the many stories, right? That you are,
yeah,
you'll uncover and find that things weren't necessarily black and white and things
yeah.
weren't, always how they were. Like, the other thing as well is just knowing that, I think we talked before, recording is the fact that, with the abolitionists, they were Quakers. And then to
Mhm.
know that Quakers actually owned slaves in Jamaica,
Yeah.
and they were in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean, but they were a
Yeah.
different, right? They weren't
Yeah.
necessarily the abolitionists in England, demanding that people have their freedom.
Yeah. And the way, what I think is kind of interesting is that, like, I think that speaks to how integral the systemization of enslavement was critical to, like, the bare bones economy, because you have
Yeah.
Quakers that were in New England, who, were, there was the earliest group of abolitionists in the United States were the Quakers. But then if you go to if you go to Jamaica, if you go to the Caribbean, you'll find that they were enslavers themselves. I think that is
Yes.
also true. What I think is potentially most fascinating is, when it comes to individuals of religious groups who were enslavers, the Jesuits.
Yes.
My previous institution was a Jesuit college, and one of the things that the institution is kind of going through right now is thinking about the fact that part of the college was built on the selling of enslaved laborers from the Jesuits to the larger Baltimore area, to continue to build the college. And the same exact story was happening in Georgetown University in DC. And what I think is quite fascinating is that there's an individual by the name of Jean-Pierre Labat who wrote this huge, like, two volume kind of manual for surviving the West Indies, and includes, like, historical and geographic kind of information about the West Indies. And he himself was a French Jesuit, and so it's interesting that, and he was probably one of the most well-known enslavers of the period. And so there's something to be said about how the idea of seeming hypocrisy that exists in terms of, like, religious canon, kind of flying in the face of these massive economic systems where incorporation, participation, and success in that economy means, in fact, maybe doubling, or to hold back a reserve, like, or to even defy religious canon, to
Yes.
defy, like, what your beliefs are supposed to be. And I think we get that with the Quakers and the Jesuits that were there in the
Yes.
Caribbean.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. Because they were all considered to be, I guess, the dissenter religions, right? So anything that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't part of the Church of England was considered to be dissenters, right? So
Yes.
it's just one of those things. And, coming across all of this language, that's the other thing that you come to realize is that things were slightly different. It's not, the change of all of that. So it's, it's just something to think about, right? And to kind
Absolutely.
of reflect on. And that's why I guess with your article, it kind of highlights the agency or the lack thereof of the enslaved women had in shaping their own destinies within the context of property ownership and inheritance. Can you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm not anticipating that folks will have read the article
Mhm.
before they listen to this podcast. So I'll give a brief
Yeah.
overview here. So this particular article, which is featured in a larger volume of the Journal for 18th Century Studies, it was a larger volume that looked at specifically the relationship between women and property of the long 18th century. Most of the work focuses on, it's a British journal, so a lot of the energies focus on England, and the Greater Britain. But I with my own specialization, I looked at three particular women who
Mhm.
were living in the British West Indies, or I guess Judith Philippe, kind of depending
Yep.
upon what year we're working with. She's either in the French or the British. But the article itself presents the lives of three women: Judith Philippe, Anne Maitland, formerly Anne Wright, and Dorothy Bennett, who was a new figure that kind of emerged out of the research that I did on the other two women. Each of these figures, had an ancestral maternal connection to the system of slavery. Judith Philippe and Anne Maitland, of the three, were incredibly wealthy. They were able to move to the United Kingdom. They lived in England for a period of time. Maitland stayed. Judith Philippe at in 1807 she decided to come back. We can speculate about why 1807, the year right before the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, why she made that decision to go back to keep a closer eye on her properties potentially. Speculation is there for the taking with that. These two women cemented their relationships with white men, either through marriage or through long relationships that were outside of wedlock, but still, if not necessarily monogamous, they were long term. Dorothy Bennett, who I kind of would argue is the more interesting of the women. She was born enslaved. Indeed, Dorothy Bennett had to be written down twice as free during her life. And so that lends to a kind of interesting idea of what her subject position would have been in between the times where she was apparently free at the age of 13, but then had to be freed again later on as she was marked in her father's will as inheriting property. And so her mother, Dorothy Bennett's mother, who we only have her first name, Sylvia, remained enslaved to the Bennett family her entire life. And I think in terms of these women having agency or not having agency, in terms of how these women shaped their own destinies, the hard truth of the matter is that all three women, relied upon and strategically aligned themselves with white men, whether it be a father, a lover, or a husband. And just speaking to the truth of the period, it would have been difficult for any woman to live independently of that period, which is why I think Judith Philippe is just, can I curse?
Yes.
That's why I think Judith Philippe is such a badass. Is because like she refused to give up that agency. Both Maitland and I guess Dorothy Bennett too, though Dorothy Bennett would have not had the same level of kind of social prowess as Judith Philippe had. Neither of those women married. And so there's this, there are legal implications to that, in the sense that within the British Caribbean, there were laws against marriage between folks of different racial backgrounds. But it would have been possible for Judith Philippe to marry the guy that she spent a lot of time with. His name was Edward Thornton. She was French. She was of French ancestry. He's of English ancestry. And so if they had been married under the French, when French had occupied Grenada at the time, then their marriage would have been fine. However, when the British took over, it would have been considered a clandestine marriage, not necessarily because of issues relating to race, but because of issues relating to national identity and religious backgrounds. And so, but the thing is that all of these women, part of their wealth, part of their kind of security in the spaces that they lived in was in part due to their adult associations with plantation men. And I think one of the kind of what we see in terms of their wills, how they secure financially and socially the benefits for their own daughters, especially with Maitland and with Philippe, is the fact that there is an awareness of how risky being an independent woman without means is, especially if you were born, especially if you were born with being born to a woman of color. So like the mixed ancestry, I think has a bit more damning. You're potentially more targeted in terms of being a woman who owns property. And so that's, I don't know, I thought that there was something that was really interesting. So like, yes, these women had agency. Yes, these women, especially when you look at the life of Judith Philippe, who is just an immensely just stronghold of a woman. Um, but these women had to strategize. These women had to align themselves smartly because of the conditions that were situated around their identities as women of color. And so I find that so fascinating, is that these women were so aware, and they took individualistic, opportunistic, and potentially, I mean, the opportunistic decisions had negative implications for others in certain circumstances. And so I think just being mindful of that, to your point that you said earlier on, Wendy, like it's really nuanced. It's not just black and white. There's so many shades of gray in between. And I find that so fascinating.
No, definitely, because I mean, what you're describing is exactly, as I said, exactly what has happened in my family line that I was able to discover and it depended because they were in what is now present day St. Catherine, which at the time would have been St. Thomas Vale, which was probably, more populous, a little bit more. They had a little bit more leeway to be able not to be married, but they definitely were associated to the right people. Just what you said, they had to strategize, they had to think beyond just themselves.
Yeah.
And how it was going to be for their children. And that's the other thing that I found really interesting is their children's, married. But again, they were aligned to certain people, certain things for them to be able to ensure that the inheritance then went to the next generation.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly right.
I mean, I know that we're kind of, we're still kind of, talking on this, but I don't know if there's anything more on that point in terms of, just that linkage of, race, gender, property ownership during this time. Is there anything else that we didn't cover about it?
Yeah. No, I think in terms of the intergenerational kind of element that you're alluding to, like what I find really fascinating. So I have access, or thankfully, folks have access to the wills of Maitland and Philippe. I do not have any access to Dorothy Bennett's will.
Okay.
I think or do I? No, I do not. Sorry, I'm thinking about Dorothy Bennett in particular. But in the wills of Maitland and Philippe, they're very clear, crystal clear about who is going to be the executors of their wills, who is going to be serving to inherit, how much they are inheriting. Like the level of attention to detail is striking in these wills, because it relates specifically to their daughters. And so there's significantly more vulnerability when it comes to from a woman to pass to another woman, passing properties, passing money, passing enslaved peoples. By the time that Philip and Maitland are writing their wills, the institution of slavery has ended in the Caribbean. So at least with Philippe, she's writing her will in 1845. And so that is so this is after the system of enslavement in the British Caribbean. But they like secured Maitland, for example, secured for her daughter, Rebecca Sherman, a trust. And Maitland made sure that Rebecca's husband was going to be the executor of said will. So Anne Maitland made sure that that money was going to be, she wrote out crystal clear that her daughter is receiving this inheritance. And by making her daughter's husband the executor, she's essentially making sure that like it's staying within the family, which I think is, that's smart. That was a smart thing to do. And so it's like, and that kind of foresight is what I applaud in these women, in terms of how they navigated the system of enslavement, how they navigated the system of being a woman of color, of being a woman. When it comes to property laws, when it comes to social laws that are situated to marginalize women, how they were able to navigate that is just, I mean, it's brilliant. It's difficult to say they were smart, and they knew how to work the system.
Yes, to their advantage. And it just showed that whether you want to, realize it or not, they had a lot of power, and they were able to exact it the way that they wanted it to. Right? So it was just, I mean, I think that was one of the things that really got to me, looking at all of these records and knowing that, they're making deals, they're selling their land, or they're, whether it's just for leasing, or they're buying land, they're leasing it out, their contracts. And I'm just looking at this going, this is unreal. And never would I have ever imagined that during this particular time frame period, that not only were they free, but they were able to do all of these things, which is just, for me, just unreal, just completely unreal, So
and I think, no, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, to that point, I think that speaks to the kind of the less applaudable, the less applaudable kind of elements to the decisions that they made, right? Because, a noble person, the best moralistic person would potentially manumit all their enslaved people, sell off their land, and then become a Quaker in New England, if not in Jamaica, right?
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is that these women who were strategic, who were opportunistic, who were kind of thinking about themselves and their future, and their legacies, they, as we kind of indicated, their strategy and their agency included, leasing their enslaved to other plantation workers. It involved accumulating more property so that they could have more enslaved laborers. It included the purchase of enslaved laborers, and so yes, the article follows these three women, and certainly there are moments where we were just like, yes, go get it, yes, but then also, in getting it, to use the kind of, very informal phrasing, they're participating in institution. Their power is gained through slavery. And what I think is, for none of these women, at least from what I have kind of seen in my research of them, there was no sense of urgency when it came to liberating their enslaved laborers. The records indicate that they were, quote unquote, and a big air quotes here, they were kind enslavers, but and a way to track that is to look to see if there were any accounts of like hostility shown against the enslaved, and so you can only surmise that an individual is a good enslaver because they haven't violated, murdered, or beaten to the point of hospitalization. They're enslaved laborers, and so like just that kind of element is something that is a terrible thing to have to discuss, but is true.
Mm-hmm.
And so while the records indicate that they were, purportedly kind enslavers, they still benefited from the forced free labors of others. And so they contributed to the economy that profited from racist logic and systems of oppression. When I think, as Eric Williams argues in his 1990 or 1944 book, which is like, it was such a forward-thinking book. It certainly, it was ahead of its time, certainly, but this 1944 publication of Capitalism and Slavery, written by Eric Williams, it's a great read for individuals who are maybe wanting to learn more about how like systems and how economy feeds into the kind of social stratification that lends itself to racist logic, that lends itself to justifying the enslaved labor of folks of African ancestry by folks of European ancestry, like where that kind of comes from in terms of economy and slavery. It's a great book, great start. And so, at least within the context of what he was saying is that slavery, which is he argues that the systems of enslavement, slavery as an economic model is what happens when capitalism goes off and it's unregulated. But it was that system in which these women lived their lives. It is how they got and maintained their wealth. And so from what I can tell in terms of the property records, with the exception of one girl at the age of 15, who was manumitted by Judith Philippe's mother, there's only one individual in terms of the whole history of the women and their mothers and grandmothers that I have studied. There's only one person who was manumitted before, like openly manumitted before the abolition of slavery or emancipation, right, in 1836. Mm-hmm. From what I gathered in the property records, it seems that it wasn't until their descendants were compelled by law to manumit their enslaved, and then were then compensated for that. And compensated well. Yes. And so that is something that's something that is a part of the story too, is that these women held on to their enslaved laborers as much as they could because they benefited from it. And it wasn't until 1836, even though the law was in place in 1833, it wasn't really until 1836 that the emancipation processes and compensation went into action in terms of the way that British enslavers or British colonial enslavers would then manumit their enslaved. So there wasn't a whole lot of urgency for these women to let go of their positions.
Exactly, because this meant their livelihood pretty much, and so they weren't going to let that go, unfortunately. But as I said, it has me thinking back to that one particular family member that yes, she owned slaves, but yet she was willing to assist others that were running away from their owners, and to be able to assist them and to harbor them. So I just find that just that alone is just like unbelievable.
Yeah.
In terms of that type of thinking and thinking,
that is so fascinating. I find myself super intrigued by what your ancestor was thinking in terms of, were there, there's so many ways that you can think about this, about the, it's an individual choice, she made the decision to do this for other enslaved laborers, whether that be motivated by this kind of moralistic knowledge that what she's doing is against a larger ethical code of shared humanity, or if she's maybe thinking, I don't know the ancestor, I want to know more about this person because I think that's fascinating. Or if she's thinking maybe potentially, economically, like, if my competitor is, has less labor, then I have more labor than I,
Exactly.
and so it's like, what could be motivating the decisions to participate, for a woman who was both an enslaver but also a liberator of the enslaved. I mean, it makes one, I want to have like you want to sit her down and be like, so
Exactly.
tell me,
What were you thinking? And,
what was
and
going on?
what was going on and what was your driving force, right? So it's just one of those things when you look at that and you're just scratching your head going, how can this be? And knowing that, again, these are the stories that aren't really told. And these are
Yes.
the different layers once you start peeling back the onion of slavery, of that time. And what
Hmm.
was really going on. It's not just so dry, as I keep saying, because it's not and every page I turn, it's like something else, and I'm like going, "Whoa, this is not what I
Yeah.
was expecting."
Yeah.
And you just sit back and just kind of shake your head and just kind of see, well, okay, but it kind of makes sense for right now because now I see how certain people conduct themselves, why they do what they do, because I'm pretty sure this was brought down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to be
Hmm.
told, this is what we
Hmm.
did. Right? This is
Hmm.
how we manage to make sure that the next generation is taken care of.
Yeah, agreed. I think we rely upon those stories for a sense of connection to the past, to the land that we are on, to the land that our ancestors once occupied.
Yeah.
Like we need those stories to keep us grounded to this past community of folks. Um, but I think also with those stories are shaped by and contextualize the present moment, and so I know, for example, maybe going a
Hmm.
bit personally,
Yes.
but my father told me a story when I was a little girl about how during the American Civil War in the mid 19th century, that quote brother fought against brother, and
Mm.
so that meant that there was folks who were Unionist in the North fighting secessionists from the South, and they were fighting each other, and so it was a huge, families were broken up, etc. Well, you do a little digging, and I came to the realization that that was a lie.
Yeah,
That was a story that was told to him by his grandfather, who was told to him by his
exactly.
father's father, etc. And the truth of the matter is that, kind of speaking plainly, my ancestors were secessionists. They
Mm.
all fought for the American South, um, and so and they fought to perpetuate the continuation of enslavement.
Yeah.
And so, but I think there needed to be a story of how there was an ancestor who was fighting for the Union because that was now, right? That
Yeah.
was the outcome of the Civil War. And so needing to have that narrative of like, nope, not all of our ancestors were Southern enslavers, is something that, I find kind of fascinating. And I
Yeah.
think that I think it lends itself to an important conversation that we need to have within ourselves when we're
Hmm.
thinking about, as we look back to the past, right? That like,
Yes.
it's not just cut and dry. It's not just X. It's not just Y. It's not just, not all of our ancestors were brilliant, amazing, incredible, thoughtful, courageous, gentle, kind people. Like some of them were assholes and manipulative. Some were just working with a broken system and tried to make
Yes.
things work for themselves and for their families and for their communities. And so it's in it, at least in my mind, when going back to the past, it's so critical for either the genealogical historian
Yeah.
or the scholar or the whomever to keep an open mind and to think about the individual contexts in which a person, as you're looking at a document and it marks a decision that has been made or a transaction that has been processed, going to the individual decisions of that person and being able to kind of piece through the documents, what may have been happening there, and to think about it from an individual perspective. And so that's something that I think is important, kind of with the research that I do.
Yes.
And for individuals who are looking to have like for those who are doing genealogical research, that's like, oh, I am the 12th granddaughter of a great king, like,
Exactly.
It's like most of us our ancestry dates back to individual experiences, individual people who were just trying to survive.
Exactly.
And so keeping an open mind, I think, is such a critical component to doing that kind of investigation, especially because it's such a personal thing that is being done.
No, definitely. Absolutely. Because I mean, you'll hear a lot of different stories, just as what
Mm-hmm.
you had described. I'll say as an example for myself is, oh, Wendy, they were missionaries. And I'm thinking, okay, wonderful that they were missionaries, but it doesn't seem to match up with what I'm uncovering. But
Mm-hmm.
you just have to be not only mindful, but I guess to be polite, let people, if they have their own stories that they want to go with, leave them. You don't necessarily have to challenge them on it. You just have to keep continuing on what you know and what you've, found, and continue with, and just go with that, and know that not everybody's going to see everything the same way that you see it. It's going to be each individual see it their own different way, and they're going to align to what story makes them feel comfortable for what they don't want to see, and that is fine, because
Yeah.
not everybody wants to, see the same things. As I said, there's just different pieces to the puzzle, and people have their own different references. That's what I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed as well. So it's just being respectful to, what people want to know, for what they're willing to know and what they want to know. Those are
Yeah.
two totally different things, right? So
Yes. Yes. It is true that everybody, it's just a human thing. We need our stories
yeah.
to keep us grounded with who we are. And the idea of thinking about a story as not being true,
Mhm.
as in the case of, my father's story, like that's something that can break a person down. And so, to your
Yeah.
point, Wendy, like,
Yeah.
it's important that people hold on to the stories that they've got, because it's how they define themselves. And so, unless you're willing to put a family member in an existential crisis, like,
Yes. Yeah.
it's good that they hold on to their stories. But I also think that, like, there is going to be, if sharing the truth of this history is something that is important, which I would think that it is an important thing to share the
Yeah.
truth of this history to at least a larger audience of people. There is a process of kind of healing, I think,
Yes. Yes.
that can happen if the truth is then kind of set in front of you and it's undeniable. And so, again, too, as a historian, you have to, like, weigh the fact that that your family members have stories that they hold so close to them. But if you find, like, through the historical records that, like, it belies a kind of darker history, then, how can you be sensitive to this story as well, at the same time kind of sharing the truth,
Yes.
of the lived experience of ancestors. And so it's just like history itself, it is very sticky business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I truly appreciate, when I came across this article, it was
Mm,
almost something of not necessarily a justification, but I guess just to know that this has actually been written about, and not just me one time finding this information and knowing that this is totally different from the history that I've been told, just in general, and then
mhm.
coming to find this type of history, going, oh, there's many different layers within the context of slavery as to what was actually happening at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that this article is out. I'm not, and truth be told, I'm not the only person
Hmm.
who is writing of these fantastic figures of our past. If anybody, if anybody wants to reach out, the article is currently behind a paywall, but I would be happy to share lists of other books that are
Okay.
cited in the works cited page of folks who are doing this kind of work. There is it's worth noting that like it's not just me, like within the world of
Hmm.
18th century Caribbean studies. There's a fantastic book. There's two books that I think are worth mentioning now just because I have them on the top of my head, and that is Christine Walker's book, Jamaican Ladies, which looks
Yes.
specific. Do you know Jamaican Ladies?
I don't know it. I want to read it.
It is such a
Yeah.
good book. It is such a good book. But so Christine Walker's Jamaican Ladies, it's great. It looks specifically at women enslavers and predominantly white,
Hmm.
but we have a few who are of mixed ancestry that she talks a bit more in detail. And then Daniel Livesey's Children of Uncertain Fortune. It is a book that looks at, it's much more transatlantic in nature in the sense
Okay.
of like thinking about the Caribbean diaspora in the 18th and 19th centuries, looking at folks who were subject to inheritance and went to England.
Mm.
And so it's a kind of a catalog of these stories. The individuals that are coming out of Livesey's book are much more middle class in terms of how they were, in terms of going to school and being
Yeah.
educated with a very traditional kind of English context and English middle class life. But there is but there's an exciting kind of middling story to be shared too with these folks. And
Hmm.
then another book is Olivet Otel's book African Europeans. That's
Okay.
much more like continental in context,
Hmm.
but she looks at individuals of African ancestry who have lived on the continent, and so it's not
Okay.
just a British Caribbean context. It's far more expansive when we
Okay.
kind of zoom out into the transatlantic connections.
Perfect. I will put those in the show notes so people can link on those. So that would be great.
Perfect.
And again, I just wanted to thank you so much, Victoria, for coming on and to be able to speak to
Hope you
this
enjoyed
because it's
this
been a
episode.
fantastic
And if you did,
discussion.
please make sure to like,
Just about the
follow,
whole
subscribe,
period piece. So
and write a
thank you so
review
much.
for the
Oh my
episode
gosh, Wendy,
wherever
thank
you
you so
listen
much
to
for
your
having me. This is
podcast.
great.
Thank you.